Absent. Kammerer.
Here.
Carbonaro.
Here.
Martin.
Here.
Ranke.
Present.
Shipman.
Here.
President Wallace.
Present. The only item on the agenda this evening involves the Public Works Committee, and I will go ahead and offer my assistance to Chairman Ahrens and request that this long, very thorough study be delivered to us by Mr. Burke.
Mr. Mayor, you all have met Dr. Burke, who will go through the study. I also wanted to point out that Mark Emery, where'd Mark Emery go, has done all the legwork in terms of negotiating and understanding the costs from the city of Chicago and a lot of the other work putting together, so I wanted to make sure we introduced Mr. Emery. The long-term potable water supply is an issue that the board has identified as a top priority in the village for a couple of years, actually several years. Our contract with Elgin is up in 2019, and so we began looking at this issue a few years ago, and then about 2.5 years ago began to identify our options, go through those options in detail, and try to come to some conclusions. And so tonight we have the first review of that. As I've discussed with the mayor, this won't be the first time. This will be one of many reviews with the board or the public. We're not in a hurry to make a decision. This is a critical decision, and so I wanted you not to feel like this was the only time. We will be reviewing this at length.
It's a fairly lengthy report, so I think it would benefit us all to let Dr. Burke go, jot down your questions while he's going through, and then maybe at the end. He said it's going to take quite some time to go through it once, and if we keep stopping and
hold your applause.
Yeah, just hold the applause until the end. Let's jot down as many notes as we can.
I do have it scheduled for the next agenda, so I think we'll go through maybe an abbreviated version to start out next meeting, and then lots of questions and see where it goes from there. So thank you, Dr. Burke.
Thank you, Valerie. And again, thank you for the opportunity to work on the project. We've been working on this for a while. We certainly enjoyed a relationship with the staff, exploring these different options that I'm about to talk about today. And I hope not to make it very technical. If you want technical backup, we've tried to provide it in the document, and hopefully just kind of give a summary. Why now? As Valerie said, your agreement's ready to expire. Right, to give you a basis, maybe you all knew this, 45% of the water that you provide your citizens comes from wells that you own. The rest of it, about 55%, comes from the city of Elgin. So that's how you've been getting your water for a good period of time. And that's the average number. Some days it's different, but on the average, that's how it lays out. As Valerie said, we started out with the agreement in 1984, and believe it or not, it's ready to be looked at again. Your requirement of your agreement says you need to give notice to the city of Elgin what you're going to do when it expires in 2019, and that's the purpose of that. So right now, there's two numbers here. Keep in mind, you pay 1.25 or 25% bump over what the Elgin residential customer is charged. So Elgin is a little bit different than other communities that take Lake Michigan water, like Oak Lawn. Oak Lawn in the south suburbs takes Lake Michigan water and wheels it out to a bunch of other communities, over 10 of them. But all they do is take the water, they may put some chlorine in it, store it, but distribute it. They're not manufacturing the water. Elgin manufactures the water, if you want to use that term. They take the water from the river, they treat it, they pump it, they chlorinate it, they pump it, store it, and then give it to us. So obviously there is going to be an increase in the overall demand over the next 35 some odd years, and we show this starting in year 2015. I want to point out that the blue is the average day, and we're not showing or anticipating a significant rise in the demand, but a pretty steady one. That blue is the average day, and the average day is about 4 million gallons per day. That's what you get. That's what you need to supply the needs of the village on an average day. There is a peak day if there's a drought, a fire, and extraordinary events. There's a peak number there, and you need to make sure that you have adequate storage and ability to provide that. So this is what your system looks like, and maybe some of you know about this, but for those of you that don't, right here at 31 West 124 Route 20 Lake Street, that's where you take your water from Elgin. All right, you take it, and you just can't tap it into the pipe. You have to meter it. They want to know how much water you're using, as you would if you were selling it. Then it's pumped into the system, and you have very nice, very clean-looking pump stations, and that's what it looks like from the street, and that's what it looks like when you open the doors. So you have pump stations, you have a big investment, you are metering the water and pumping it into your system. You also have your own wells. As I said, about 45% of your water is manufactured by you. This is what you have 3 deep wells, 2 with, I'll use this term, WRT treatment, and that is that takes out the radium and barium that's embedded in the water. It's a naturally occurring substance. It's when you get really deep, you're getting water that has that, and you remove it. So WRT is the entity that cleans up the water from the respective of radium and barium. And so this is these are stars, are the approximate locations of your deep wells. I think you all understand that you don't cluster all the deep wells because they all would draw down the water too much, so they're distributed over the village, and you can see what they're located. Now you also have 4 shallow wells, and these shallow wells have a propensity to have iron, so you remove iron at 2 of those locations, and you can see the geographic distribution of those 4 shallow wells. So you have a combination that helps you blend the water and meet water quality requirements as well. You have 5 elevated storage tanks. Everybody in Chicagoland has elevated storage tanks. And the reason is your demand during a day, in the given day, exceeds your ability to strictly pump it or take it from your wells or from your from Elgin. So at night, when the demand is almost negligible, we pump water up to the water tanks so that we can ride off that fluctuation during the day. And so this is a common practice in water supply engineering, and as well as the storage that's provided in here gives you additional storage in case you have a failure in the system or you have extraordinary events such as a fire. So that's what the water elevated tanks, some of them look like. Then you have 3 ground storage tanks, and number 1 and 2 have 0.5 million or 500,000 gallon storage facilities. So that's what those look like, and the idea here once is to buffer the demand. So you also have almost 200 miles, a big investment, almost 200 miles of water main. This does not include the lines that run from everyone's home to the water line up to the so-called Buffalo box, but that's just water mains. So you have a huge investment, a vast distribution of the water mains. You can see that the distribution of the different storage facilities and wells is shown here, and the proximity, of course, which you know, of the neighboring communities. This is just a simple exhibit that shows where why that we call them deep wells and shallow wells. What you really only need to look at is perhaps the fact that wells 1, 2, 5, and 6 are on the range of 65 to 400. That's the term shallow well. And it penetrates into the upper aquifer that lies above the bedrock, and there's a screen where you are screening out, keeping the sand and gravel from coming up with water. That's contrasted to a deep well, which is shown over here, and wells 4, 7, and 8 are deep, and they're down below in the deeper aquifer below that initial bedrock, and we tap in, and these can be 1,400 to 2,000 feet. So you're drilling a relatively small diameter shaft, a very long distance, and that's how you extract out and mine the wells. Obviously, most of DuPage County used to be on wells before they started obtaining Lake Michigan. Some of the Fox River communities are on wells, and I'll point out what your neighbors are doing. As I said, the deep wells can produce anywhere between 700 to 1,200 GPM, gallons per minute. Okay, I used the term earlier, MGD, which is million gallons per day. That's a volumetric flow rate. We use GPM when we're looking at wells and little pumps, because that's a more reasonable number. Shallow wells can get is more variable depending on the stratum and the quality of the water at that location of the aquifer. So that gives you an idea of what you're restricted to and the capacity of those wells. The deep wells, as I said, WRT is used. It's sand treatment. The sand is recycled or taken out for barium and radium removal. The shallow wells, you have iron removal, and well 5, the water contains hydrogen sulfide, which people can take well water, but no one really likes the rotten egg type smell associated with hydrogen sulfide. So that's used for emergency purposes only. Hardness, which is something I'll talk about briefly in a few minutes here, is not presently removed from the water that you are extracting from your wells. The hardness is we have one more term, it's grains. Now I try to figure out an easy way to explain it. It's a measurement of the hardness. All of us that have had raw well water know it has a sharp taste to it, contrasted to the Culligan treated water that we get. And so what we did is compare the 8 wells that you currently have and the measured hardness of each one of those wells, and compare it to the treated Elgin water that you're currently receiving, as well as the Lake Michigan water. So you can see that based on this graphical representation, if nothing else, you're considerably harder than the water that gets from Lake Michigan and from Elgin. And that's something people can get their arms around, and so we're representing what those are. That's grains per gallon, a unit of measurement that's used in the water production business. One of the other things when you start considering the different options, it's the age of the wells. Some of these wells, as you can see, have been in place a very long time. Well number 1 since 1923, and you can see that your most recent well was 1981. Certainly they've been in there for a long time. They are not going to last forever. Things rust on the bottom, way down below. These screens on the shallow wells have a tendency to fail eventually, and sometimes you have other anomalies in the subsurface that cause difficulties. But we pointed this out because when you start looking at, and we've included cost, that eventually you're going to have to upgrade various types of pump and perhaps the wells themselves, well casings. So how long do the wells last? As I said, the number 1 is built in 1927. It's still at its original pumping performance. The older shallow wells, you start having screen failure, corrosion. The steel casing has only about an 80-year life. These are things that have a finite capacity, so that's recommended, and you follow this where you rebuild or recondition your pumps for your wells every 7 to 15 years, just because of the wear and tear on those units. What can go wrong with wells? As I said, you can have the casing or the screen fail. The iron bacteria, which clogs the well especially the screens. You have differentials, you have anomalies in water quality. These are things that are, as I said, up to 1,200 feet below. Very deep. Shallow wells are susceptible to some cases surface spills, contaminants. Certainly the shallow ones are more susceptible to droughts. And you know that throughout the Chicagoland area, where we had a drought within the last decade, you saw a lot of the communities even having, because they had just wells only, a well-only community stop watering because of the proximity of the wells. So you know that the droughts can have an impact. The Illinois State Water Survey does a lot of work on these deep wells because there needs to be one agency that kind of looks out and sees what everybody's doing and how everybody's operating. And they predict that there will be a continued high withdrawal rates in the future, and they are really not certain as to what the well capacities and the water quality will be in the future. So that's a document. At the beginning of our report, we referenced the Illinois State Water Survey and the input they provided us when we were looking at the long-term viability of some of these options. Long-term sustainable water supply options. What do the other communities in the neighborhood use? Elgin uses the Fox River and has a well backup. Streamwood, Hanover Park, and Carroll Stream have Lake Michigan water. I'll say this once, and we'll just call it JAWA if it's okay. That's a Northwest Suburban Municipal Joint Action Water Agency. So rather than repeating that, I'll talk about JAWA versus the Water Commission, which is the DWC. That's the DuPage Water Commission. They both purchase, on behalf of multiple communities, purchase Lake Michigan water. They store it, they put chemicals in it, and they send it out to their communities. So that is what the Carroll Stream, Hanover Park, and Streamwood are doing. West Chicago, South Elgin are on wells, and Wayne is on primarily shallow individual wells that have the propensity to go dry at some period of time. Not in Wayne, but in other locations. Neighborhood water, community water sources. This shows up in much better color than on in your reports, and you can see we've identified Bartlett in the middle with the Elgin and the other surrounding communities, and the mix of water supply, water sources that those communities obtain their water from. So we looked, based on many discussions, we looked at 5 different alternatives, which I will go through this evening. The first one is status quo. Buy some from Elgin, have your own wells, put new wells in as you need additional demand, and just keep on operating as you currently are. The second option was to go 100% to Elgin. That is, make a connection, use your existing connection as well as a new connection to Elgin. The third option was to say, all right, goodbye Elgin at the end of 5 years, or at some point we're going to stop buying water from you. We're going to go 100% well water. Change to Lake Michigan was one of the options, using the water from JAWA, which means you do a different connection than if you wanted to obtain the water supply from the DuPage Water Commission. So those are the 5 options that we looked at, and tried to look at the pros and cons of those options, the relative cost for implementation, and give you an idea of what this means. Not only the 10 years out, but also 20 years out, when you're going to have to incur additional costs. Just to give you a reference, hopefully a level playing field for each one. So one is the alternative, which is a status quo. And we have little schematics up here. The 2 schematics show how you get the water. So Elgin has a water main, and you tap into that water main with another big water. These are not small pipes. These are relatively large pipes that you tie into. As I showed you earlier, you do have a pumping station where you take their water, increase the pressure energy, so you can tie it into your distribution, that almost 200 miles of distribution. So you're grabbing it, pushing it, putting more pressure or energy into it via the pumps, and you distribute it to the system. You also have, as I showed earlier, all those wells. You have a number of wells that you also take water. You're either you're removing some iron in the cases of the shallow wells, or you're treating it for the deep wells. And in each case, you're putting it back into the system. So you're taking water at two locations, and you are putting it into the system, into that long, big jumble of water mains that you have that circulate the water to the community. You're doing this every day. So that's one of the options that we have to look at. So the status quo description would be to continue that procedure. In the 20 years, you need to put in 2 new deep wells to meet that demand that we identified, that increasing demand, and those are going to require well treatment plants. We know that that would be something that you would, at a minimum, want to do. You would also, we are assuming that if you stayed with this, that you would now take your water that you're getting that's relatively hard, we established that, and treat it, soften it, which is what a lot of the communities are doing, and that because you're increasing the demand over the years, that eventually within that 20-year plan, you're going to need 4 million gallons of additional storage. So we've tried to put all those in. If you follow the status quo, this is what you would be prudent from a water supply engineering perspective to pursue. So we identified the different near-term and future, and we've done this for all of the options. So you're going to see the same type of approach. And so this gives you the total capital expenditures over the 20 years, the next 20 years. And this is a gauge, just trying to put everything in terms of common numbers. You can see that you have a elevated storage tank here that gets constructed in the first 10 years, and 3 more million-gallon worth of storage tank in the future. So we try to include everything. We identified that you would need to purchase a well, not only a land for a well, you'd have to locate it. You would put it in a location that would handle your new development over that time frame, and not next to one of the other well sites. So that's what we quantified. And then for each one of these alternatives, you're going to see the same format. Alternative 1 gives you the flexibility of looking at adding future well capacity as needed. It has the least change from the existing or current operations. You have 2 sources of water. Not everything is in one basket, and less susceptible to problems from a single source, and it has a lower near-term capital cost than Lake Michigan or the 100% well option. The cons, certainly, and this is going to be true on a lot of these options, the uncertainty as to the water well quality. Certainly, we know that well quality is something that you're having to meet all sorts of water quality standards with your wastewater treatment plant and your wells over time. Certainly the parameters that were measured or held to, we were held to 20 years ago are no longer the ones that you're held to today. We know that in the long term there will be additional water quality standards. There's certainly uncertainty with the useful or service life remaining on the existing wells. As I mentioned briefly, you have more regulatory compliance, and you're going to have to hire more staff to man these additional wells. These are things that would be the cons for the alternative 1. So what we did in this particular exhibit, we tried to show a quantitative, qualitative visual assessment of how this alternative meets certain criteria. And those criteria are included here, and these 6 are used in all of the alternatives. I'll go through them briefly. Long-term sustainability of the source. That's what we looked at for each one of those options that we're going to talk about. The capital cost, the cost of water production. Okay? You are, in this scenario, still responsible for producing 45% of the water. So under this scenario, you're in the business of water production. Phase construction is something, the phase construction, the improvements, the predictability of future rate increases, and the increased water operating fund cost. So, as I said, you look at these 6 criteria. Less favored is the long-term sustainability. Capital cost is favorable. The cost of water production is favorable. The phase construction of the improvements and the predictability of rate increases, neutral, and the fact that you're going to have to hire more staff in the future would be less favored. So that's what, and the color coding is shown down here. So we try to look at it. We'll compare all of them at the end. The second alternative, and you'll hear more about this alternative, is to obtain all of your water from Elgin. Put them responsible for manufacturing the water, getting it to you. So, as I said, this is what you have right now. This is, you get that connection, and just like I showed you on the previous slides, for alternative 1, the only situation different is that you would have one more of these. You'd have to construct one more connection to the Elgin system so that in the future you could take more water. As number 1, we're going from 55 to 100%. We need to have a bigger connection long term for this alternative. Alternative 2, the summary is, well, as you would expect, everything is coming from Elgin. You discontinue your well use. You reduce, under the scenario that we've proposed, you reduce the water cost by a minimum of 10%, and you limit the annual rate of increase. We'll talk about that later on. What Elgin does now is increase, annual or on a semi-frequent basis, increase what they charge to their customers. What we've proposed is capping that increase to 2.5% as a maximum. Look at phase and implementing these connections over 10 years, which has a very low near-term capital cost. And as I said, you have in years 10 to 20, you put another connection. So you would also use your existing wells, maybe, or just get an agreement with one of the adjoining communities for emergency interconnect. Emergency interconnect is something very common that you see in lots of communities. You have a friendly neighbor where if your system went down for some reason, you'd have emergency connection to your other neighbor. One of the problems, though, if you keep your existing wells, you just can't keep them, and it's not like that car in the garage that you hope it starts when it's been there for a long time. These things have to be exercised. They have to be cleaned, and keeping wells as backup gets to be fairly labor intensive and expensive. You'll see a lot of the communities that used to have emergency wells for DuPage County Water Commission no longer have those wells. So here are the capital improvement costs for the short term, the near term, as well as the long term. That total comes out to be about $20 million. As I said, you need to get in the year 10 to 20, you're getting that second Elgin connection. That would be a new transmission line. So we quantified where we would approximately where we would connect to, determine the cost of that connection, and those things are included in this estimate. So you can see that this comes out for capital improvements about $20 million. So what are the pros associated with this? Certainly you can get, we believe, a lower multiplier and lower unit cost for purchasing the water than you currently are getting today, because you're getting a higher volume. So our argument to the staff at Elgin, proposal that you see later on, is that if you're taking 100%, then that bump, that surcharge they place, needs to be reduced. And we have it, the more water you use, the lower that bump or surcharge would be. So we'll talk about that. This option has the longest near-term capital expenditures and the lowest future capital expenditures. So the village is out of pocket the least as far as capital expenditures is concerned. You're able to phase in the construction that allows you to do the planning, design, and of course, most importantly, the financing of these improvements over time. You already have established a good relationship with the water supply partner, and you can continue that. No new construction. Elgin doesn't have to put new intakes doesn't have to fool around with their system to be able to give you this much additional water. Their water treatment plant has already been built to handle this. Certainly we all anticipated in all of our work that the economy would not take the have the hiatus that it's had over the last 7-8 years, and they built up for the future, and they have, based on the conversations that we've had, adequate supply to handle the increased percentage of water they were providing Bartlett. The other pros that certainly it eliminates the uncertainties associated with groundwater availability. It does also eliminate the uncertainties about the how much longer you got on these wells and the casings. Their water is already softened, so that's certainly an advantage. And it also takes you out of the water supply business, having to meet the regulatory compliance issues. And the State Water Survey, the aforementioned state agency that says that the Fox River is capable of long-term higher withdrawal rates than you currently have with the system. What's the con? It's a surface water, right? It's susceptible, like any surface water, to water quality issues. That, of course, is then the problem of algae to deal with. And certainly that is the one con that you have for any water supply, whether it's the large Lake Michigan water or other water bodies that we're supplied with water from. So that's the summary of alternate 2. In this particular graph, you can see that the long-term sustainability is favorable, capital cost is the most favorable, cost of water production is neutral. You're still paying for someone else to manufacture your water. You phase in the improvements, predictability of rate increases, very favorable. The proposal, you've locked in what they can increase you on a given year, regardless of what improvements they have to make. The water operating fund cost for personnel and commodities, it's most favorable because that takes you out of the well production and well operation business. Alternative 3 would be to change everything, get rid of algae and get yourself more invested in wells. Obviously, that would require that you discontinue getting water from algae, put new deep wells, new well treatment plants, and to accommodate that 55% that you're getting from algae, and add softening, as I mentioned earlier. This gives you an idea of the relative cost that you would be looking to incur if you did the 100% well supply. This would be, you would be taking, putting in the new wells to right off the bat. You need to make up not only the 55% that you're getting from Bartlett or from Elgin, but also the increased demand. So the total cost there is almost $39 million for the alternative 3 option. Pros, you don't have to pay anybody to produce your water. You're producing it. Village is not dependent on the outside entity. You have more flexibility for accommodating future water. So those are the pros. The cons, you have a high expenditure, high cost. You have it's the highest near-term capital cost. You have the uncertainty with the water quality. We've talked a lot about that. You have the uncertainty with well water quality and the treatment that you're going to have to do in the future, and you don't, again, know how long the wells are going to last. More staff, you're going to have to add more staff on to operate these existing wells. You got to be responsible for compliance, and of course, the useful life. You've invested in that connection, and that useful life of that option goes away. Here's a comparison of alternative 3, long-term sustainability. It's the least favored, capital cost less favored, most favorable is the cost of water production, phase construction of the improvements, least favored, predictability is less favored, and finally the water operating cost, because the additional staff that you have to put in, is the least favored. Okay, alternative 4. Alternative 4 is connecting up to a Lake Michigan water source. And this particular one is Jawa, and this would be, let me just show you. In this particular case, Lake Michigan Water, LMW. Really complicated. We like it. Engineers like abbreviations. Lake Michigan Water. You get it from a source, and just because there's a water main nearby does not mean it has sufficient size and capacity. Those of you that you know what the size of the straw that you get at McDonald's. It's not the same size of the straw that you get when you have a mixed drink, as an example, because you're thirsty and you're going to be sucking down that large McDonald's cup. So you need to have a straw or a pipe, in this case, that's large enough to draw the water out, and that's what the analogy would be. So what we did is we looked at, and you're going to see in a second, where we would need to tie in. So what we would do is, let me go back here, we'd have a long line that would take the water, and this line would have to be adequate sized. We'd have to draw all the water from that pipe, and we take it to the village. We'd have some type of what's called delivery structure. That delivery structure has gauges, and it may have an air gap and other appurtenances that are specific to taking water. The Water Commission, which is as well as JAWA, are wonderful agencies. They're staffed with great professionals and a great. They couldn't have been more helpful during this whole process. And they have these standard delivery structures, and that's what we show there. And then we would take it into a ground storage tank, and then we would take it into a pump station, and then pump it into the system. And that's pretty much what every community does. They take the water, the JAWA or the Water Commission says, we'll give it to you at this pressure. It's your responsibility to store it and pressurize it so that you can accommodate your whole system. We're going to measure all that water, and that's what's the part of the delivery structure. So that's how the system would operate for the JAWA as well as the DuPage Water Commission. So that's the same for both the Alternative 4 and Alternative 5. So what we would do is we would have to go to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and tell them that we want an increase in the Lake Michigan allocation. As you probably know, and it's been more often reported since the Asian carp issue has come into play. Right now, all the water that a significant amount of the land that used to drain to Lake Michigan now drains away from Lake Michigan. There's a low subcontinental divide, roughly along Ridge Road, go figure, what used to all go to Lake Michigan. About 1900, they reversed the river. Everybody's heard about that. And now all that storm water, as well as the drinking water that would, all the storm water, first of all, that used to go to Lake Michigan, now gets treated and sent down the sanitary ship canal to the Mississippi River. So that's storm water that's being diverted out of Lake Michigan. In addition, Lake County, Will County, DuPage, and almost all of Cook take other waters out of Lake Michigan. It goes to the wastewater treatment plant, right? Obviously, gets treated and goes to the Mississippi River. It's not going back into Lake Michigan. So this, about a long time ago, the Supreme Court was challenged, and there was a limit to how much water could be taken out. So there's a Supreme Court decree that says we can limit the water to 3,200 and other cubic feet per second, all in every day on the average. So when the Lake Michigan diversion accounting requires that we have to go to get an allocation. The good news is that we're below our allowable, so the likelihood of getting a diversion allocation is high. I'm giving you that just because everybody throws that term out. There's a lot of other communities that are trying to grab that up in Lake County, trying to grab that allocation, trying to find someone else to wheel water to them. So that's a long discussion as to what the IDNR has to say about water withdrawals. So you would get 100% of your water, you take out the wells, discontinue getting any water from Elgin, and discontinue usage, as I said. of the well. So you have a high cost, as you can imagine. These lines are not next door to you. They have to be extended out. You have to have two sources because of redundancy. So we've included a cost for that. We've included a cost for additional water storage. We estimated that there's a buy-in fee, and that the buy-in fee is the cost that the other the communities that were the original funders of the Jawa, or in the next example, the Water Commission, require. They had to put a lot of money in to get these lines extended from the city of Chicago out to the that. And in this particular case, Jawa is spending a lot of money because they're relocating their lines to accommodate the expansion of the Jane Addams Tollway. So they have a big improvement that they're undertaking. So we've included a rough estimate, and I should have pointed out earlier, when you see this WRT, early contract termination, in a lot of these options that include getting rid of the wells, that's a contract that you currently have with the guys that treat your wells for barium, as an example, that sand filter that I talked about earlier. So that's included. So that's a realization that if you did that on all these except for the 100% well, you have to pay that. I should have said that earlier. But this has a very high capital improvement cost, and a good portion of that is in the near term, because this is getting water to you in a completely different way. I hope that makes sense. The alternative, obviously, it's a long-term sustainable water resource. It is naturally soft, does not require treatment. The intake and the treatment plant already in place eliminates uncertainties regarding the future groundwater availability, as well as the wells reliability and long-term viability of the wells. The cons are that it does require a very high near-term capital cost, as well as the buy-in, and that buy-in is an estimate only. It does not require phasing. All improvements needed first of all, you can't phase it. You're all in. You're telling Elgin goodbye, hello, Jawa, we're all in. So there's no phasing. You can't really phase that particular option. So the study needed to determine what the capacity of these lines. That's something that Joe Fennell of the Jawa was very cooperative in explaining. They had looked at some preliminary numbers, so we used those preliminary pipe sizes in our estimates. IDNR Lake Michigan allocation, I've talked too much about that already. And little or no, this is important, little or no say over the increases. Those of us that that are familiar with Lake Michigan water, there was a big bump of 25%, and it's going to be phased in. The water supplier, meaning the City of Chicago, is upping the cost. And why they're doing it is perfectly valid. They have a lot of water mains that are well over 100 years, and they need to start upgrading, so they are increasing the cost of that supply. And so regardless of, and I'm certainly not a legal expert, people are not even bothered challenging it. So there is an increased realization of that the price that they're charging for the water supply has gone up over the last, and will continue to go up over the next year or so. Other cons associated with Alternative 4, the facilities have although the facilities have dependable track record, water must flow through miles and miles of pipe. Makes sense, right? It's not, Lake Michigan is not outside your back door. It's flowing through lots of pipes along lots of routes. The good news is the pipes are relatively young, certainly not old, but that is something that those facilities have a long way to pump and convey the water before it gets here. You have lost, it's a minus amount, the remaining useful life of the Elgin connection and the useful life of the Bartlett wells. Here's the relative comparison of the Jawa. The long-term sustainability, it's most favorable, as is on the bottom there, the increased operating fund cost. Someone else is getting the water to you. You're responsible, obviously, for the 200 miles of main, but you're no longer operating a well system, as an example. Capital cost, cost of water production, phase, the ability to phase or not phase in this case, and the predictability of future rates are all obviously least favorable. These are very, you don't have control over those, not much flexibility there. Okay, so here is the exhibit that we put in here. As I said earlier, there's in red is the Jawa schematic. These are the lines that we assumed that you would have to construct in order to connect up to Jawa. And in purple is the line that you would have to connect up to go into the DuPage Water Commission option that I'll talk about here in a second. And so, as you see, we have 2 points of connection, which is a standard. Most of the communities, almost all the communities, have 2 points of connection unless they're relatively small. So we've duplicated the approach that everybody else that has, or most people that have used the Jawa and DuPage Water Commission. So this gives you an idea of the relative location, approximate location of where we would tie in. So this is the alternative 5, and this gives you an idea. This is certainly Jawa doesn't. Lake Michigan doesn't come to them. There was, as I said, to give you an idea, Jawa takes the water. Their big storage facilities are just to the east of Mannheim Road, just right outside of Rosemont, south of Higgins, and it goes up. And the railroad tracks and goes up and towards follows roughly the Northwest Tollway. They all get their water from the intake structure in Lake Michigan, just like the DuPage Water Commission. The Jardine Water Treatment Plant, I tell my students, and I think it's cool, but if you go to Navy Pier, the 2 biggest water issues of the day, one's to your left, meaning the north, is the big water treatment. That's where the water that we all drink, if we drink Lake Michigan water, comes from, at least from Chicago, that comes from. And on the other side is that lock and dam that controls how much water comes in, and that is the possible portal by which the Asian carp can get into Lake Michigan. So on both sides of Navy Pier are the real contemporary issues with water in this particular region. But that's where they get it. They pump it a lot of times. They store it. The DuPage Water Commission does a really nice job. They store it, and they give it to the communities through very large diameter lines that are looped and redundant, and then it goes out just like all the other things into a delivery structure into the reservoir and then distributed. So that's pretty much what I showed you earlier. That just gives you an idea of the mechanism by which water, in this particular case, would come to us from the DuPage Water Commission. You would need, just like the other option, a allocation. You would want to, in this case, 100% of the water, discontinue your wells as well as eligible. This alternative, no more. This particular case, it's comparable to the Jawa capital cost. We've included the same estimate of buy-in fee. And it's not that these are buy-in fees we inferred from other proposals. It could be higher, it could be lower. We thought this was a reasonable estimate, and we used the same for both of the Lake Michigan water alternatives. And we also included in here the cost of terminating the contract on that water treatment process. But you have the same type of storage facilities. You have the length of, in this case, 24,000 feet of transmission lines that would take the water into the system. So we total that up and we get roughly $52 million of capital improvements necessary to get it from the Water Commission. Both of them have the same water. They're just proximity and size of the pipes slightly different for both alternatives. Pros and the cons. Pros, just like alternative 4, long-term great sustainable water resource, naturally soft. You've seen these before. All the cons are the same as alternative number 4. Alternative 5 cons, very similar, identical to the alternative 4. You need to do the same things, the same concerns. The high cost, they're almost the same for the capital cost. No ability to phase the project. You discontinue, you got to get everything built, and the redundancy included for that option. The same type of, you are losing the what exists of the useful lives of the connection and the wells. Same thing as alternative 4. Here's a comparison, and as you would expect, alternative 5 has the same favorable and least favored rankings that alternative 4 had. So they're the same. The only difference is the dollar associated with the capital cost. Here's that exhibit that I showed you. So this gives you an idea of where you would what you would get for the improvements. Alternative 2 up here is the transmission line. There's roughly 9,000 feet for alternative 2. That's phased in from years 10 to 20 when your demand gets higher in order to get a second connection to Elgin for alternative 2. If we're looking at alternative 4 and alternative 5, you can see, as I said earlier, this is alternative 4 in red. Purple is alternative 5. And it's a fairly, that you can figure out it's almost 5 miles, 4 miles, 4+ miles of transmission lines. That's been done before. I don't want to make it sound like it's those are the approximate locations and lengths of the alternatives 2, 4, and 5. So this is a relative comparison of the 6 criteria that we looked at, and what we did in this is identify that if you're looking at the blues being the most favorable, you can see that alternative 2, which is the 100% supply from Elgin, looks from these measuring devices or these criteria as the most favorable alternative. So we took a look at this alternative a couple different ways. We turned in, as we said earlier, that it's a long-term, cost-effective, and sustainable solution. We'll talk about this multiplier. We believe that under the staff discussions that we've had to date, that multiplier, that surcharge, could be put in place immediately, not having to wait till the end of your contract. The annual rate increases, which you'll see in a few minutes, have been much higher than 2.5%, would be capped. You eliminate the wells, the dependence on the wells, and you've already made the investment in that line, the capital improvements you have, at least in the near term. Elgin has already made their big capital improvements, the expansion of the water treatment plant. So they've done those types of improvements. There's no regulatory responsibility for that, so you're out of that job. It can be phased in over the 10 years. The improvements, Elgin is softening the water currently. They've already invested in a backup water supply, and based on the IDNR, the Fox River has the capacity. These are the comparison of each one of the alternatives. 5 is on the top, and 1, the status quo, is on the bottom. What we looked at is a summary of in purple or blue on my screen here is the total, the short term, and in brown the future capital improvements in the 10 to 20 year range, and that includes, as I said, the buy-in contract and termination costs. So you can see that the least expensive from the lowest and future capital improvement cost is alternative 2. You can see that what we said earlier was 4 and 5 were almost identical in the cost as far as short, or near and long-term capital improvements. What we did is we also broke up in terms of looking at this, at the water operating fund expenses, near and future perspective. We looked at where you would be spending money and how the costs from the water fund would be allocated. And what we have is in red the water purchase budget, because right now you purchase water from Elgin. If you went to alternatives 4 and 5, you'd be purchasing water from Jawa and Water Commission, respectively. Alternative 3, you are not purchasing water. Alternative 3 is the scenario where you are you're manufacturing your own water. We talked about the risks and the other assumptions associated with this. We show in there the well treatment costs and what that means. So this gives you a reference plane. And one of the things when you look at this, all of a sudden in alternative 3, you're not purchasing, you are the manufacturer of the water. So we try to look at this and the relative costs and the percentage that for each type of the expenditures, operation and maintenance, and debt on the capital expenses and operation expenses. So that's what we try to do and let you visualize this in a different way. Similarly, we looked at the projection annual water fund budget and looked at what the water fund with each one of these options as we've described it. So you have obviously the no wells up in 1 and 2 or 5 and 4, as well as alternative 2 partial wells in alternative 1. So you can take a look. We cite that the lowest annual water fund cost alternative with no wells, that's alternative 2. So we try to look at, once again, what you would be doing for each one of these, how you would look forward as you look at how you start mixing and purchasing your water. I said a couple times, right now you get a multiplier of 1.25. So whatever rate Elgin charges their customers, you pay 25% more. And so we met with staff and proposed, and the graphically represented here, that if Bartlett increased their water use, that bump would drop immediately from 1.25 to 1.15, meaning so a considerable reduction, and that would occur immediately. And as when we started, right now we get right now you get 4 MGD, you need 4 MGD, and as the numbers start going up and up, that number, that surcharge, as you start growing and using more water, and eventually if you get to 5.5 million gallons per day, you're getting, because you're now a major customer of Elgin, the argument here is that sliding scale gets put into place and you're paying the same, that 1 is the number here. Obviously, as your rate of usage goes up higher, the multiplier down below gets lower. So the idea here is when you get up to 5.5 million gallons per day as an average flow, then that goes to, you're paying the same rate that the Elgin residents are. The other thing is that there's the multiplier at 2.5%. That's the annual rate of increase. Right now, this is your historical increases. This is a graph that shows what the increases have been since January of 1986. You can see that in some years you are getting in excess of 8% increase. So you can see the spikes in the increase over the term of the contract that you have, the agreement that you have with Elgin. It's averaged over 4.6. The description that we have presented, the proposal that we have presented to the staff, and is capping that at 2.5%. Capping that at any given year, they can only increase what they're charging Bartlett by 2.5%. So that insulates you, that allows you, as we discussed from a staff budgeting perspective, when you have these big spikes and your water years don't necessarily coincide with theirs, the budget, you're running a deficit as far as what you are able to bill your customers, and there's a lag. This way you're insulated from those wild fluctuations. And we thought, because with this option, you are now a major customer of the City of Elgin. So in summary, the 5 alternatives. Alternative 2, the Elgin water supply 100% offers, in our words, the most favorable long-term sustainable water supply, the least amount of uncertainties, the most flexibility for implementation at the lowest capital cost. So at this point, Valerie gave me the charge to finish it up in a timely manner. I hope I was able to meet that requirement. You can see we spent a lot of effort. The report goes into a lot more detail and some more meat on these different options. I would be amiss if I didn't say again how especially cooperative the agencies were in giving us information, how forthright they were, and certainly I don't think it's a surprise to the board how cooperative and great it is to work with the staff, especially the retired Paul in the back. Has a lot of knowledge on this system, a great idea about the water quality, the water that you produce and have produced over a number of years. So that's it.
You ready to vote? Is that all you got?
Well, I was told to be brief, and I didn't go into definition of brains or anything else.
That was excellent. Thank you, Dr. Burke.
I do have.
I'm sure we do have some questions.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'll wrap this into one, so you only have to answer it.
Great.
Elgin and Lake Michigan water pretty much are the same in comparison, 8 grains.
Yes.
We're looking at costs for the new Bartlett main in excess of $10 million. For the 2,600 feet and the new 9,000 feet, 10 to 20 years.
Okay. Yes.
It's pretty comparable to the buy-in for Lake Michigan,
Yes.
and that would be our costs.
Yes.
The only thing is I think currently don't we have a 30-year contract with Elgin?
Our contract expires in 2019.
And how long was that for?
35 years given.
And
We can do another 35.
we're going to be doing another 35?
Yes. That's what we presented them with, the time of 35 years and the parameters that we've discussed tonight, and they were supportive of that. And 35 years, if you look at some of these agreements that the communities are reaching down south with, as example, Oak Lawn, it's the same duration, 35 years.
Could we go 50? Could we secure it for 50? I mean, if we're going to kill our wells, we should think, we can't go back all of a sudden in 30 years and say we need to start building wells. Can we do it for 50?
More beneficial to go
ask.
longer?
Yeah.
Good English, more beneficial?
I would have a question about the demand and how that, the increase per year, how was that calculated? That was that was slide 4. So.
I'll get to it in a second.
More swimming.
Okay. We believe that we used CMAP, the successor of NIPSI, Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, their projections. Mark, is that correct? Right. So we looked at a it used to be everybody it used to be spikes. Everybody thought there was a spikes, but there was a normal increase. Right now you're pretty flat, but there was a modest increase. Mark, do you know what the increase was? Since we're only going from 4 to just over 5, it's about 1 million gallon. It's about a 20% increase over that's over 40 years.
the CMAP projections were pretty modest on residential growth for Bartlett. There is a fair amount of predicted commercial business growth. Those numbers are in the report. If you give me a second, I could probably pull those up.
So we relied on the regional agency that considers, and you know, I believe this came from the Go to 2040 plan, which is the CMAP's projection as to what the region's growth would be reasonably predicted to be.
So commercially driven.
Residential, it's commercial that we're planning this future water demand for.
Yes, and you would do, in all these alternatives, you would build your infrastructure as you would need to do it, not right at the beginning.
That's a pretty big variable, though, isn't it? I mean, because you don't know which companies are coming in and how much water they're actually going to use.
Sure, and we've seen some communities that went in for Lake Michigan diversion allocation where they had 2 and they were asking for 5, small communities. But everybody now has tempered their growth projections, made it more reasonable. We think that based on everything that we've seen over the years, that this is a relatively conservative estimate.
And the maximum daily is at 8 because one time we had 8 million
Yes,
gallons a day?
Yes.
Was there a fire or something? What was that day?
Was it a drought, Paul? Do you remember?
Drought conditions.
And a lot of people sprinkling and, so a lot of new houses, and sod. Good point.
Well, let me ask a question about alternative 2 because you've recommended that to us. How much is an emergency interconnect? How much is maintaining one of the wells or a number of the wells? How much is that going to cost? Because obviously alternative 2 has the lowest capital improvement cost, but what are the other costs associated with it then?
Sure. One of the things that we would probably recommend, regardless of what you do, is to have that emergency interconnect. Mark, tell me if I'm wrong, and that's 500 to. I mean, you can get a really nice one for. I mean, they just put one down the street from our office, and I think all in was about $200,000. It's a relatively low cost. It's not. What you need to do is make sure that you can measure the water that is going back and forth, some type of flow meter, and some type of manual. You don't want it to be working every day. You want it to only be an emergency. So it's a relatively minor cost, probably much smaller than operating one of the wells. A lot of people kept the wells, as I said earlier. They have discontinued those wells.
And have we looked at which communities we would interconnect with?
Paul, we talked about this.
Emergency connection, we have already had some discussions prior to even starting this study. Streamwood has it on their table to come and ask us for an interconnect. They're real close, right up on Route 20. It would be very simple to do a connection. We have a major water main up there. They have a major water main right there. It would be very, very simple. It is an emergency. It's just to maintain pressure into their system. It's not to supply them underneath a full demand.
That's probably best practice anyway.
Okay, so if there was a problem with the Fox River, for example, and we had to supply ourselves with water, we'd be able to do that through an emergency interconnect with Streamwood.
That and using the storage that you have in your tanks. And the recommendations, Mark, were for 2 days?
Right. For any, especially when you have an outside source supplying you, that's a City of Chicago rule.
Mark, but we have 2 days of water supply in the reservoirs that we're proposing to put in, and we put that as a standard for all the options, correct?
That's correct.
So we have 2 days of water that is available to provide the residents and the businesses in the community.
And then after the 2 days, we would be buying water from Streamwood.
Presumably, yes.
And do we have an idea as to how much that would cost?
We have not determined what the cost would be under that option, and that exists with any of the options that we're talking about, right? If there's a disruption in the supply, you would have to look at getting another source.
If we connected to Streamwood, we'd negotiate that before, correct?
Presumably, yes. You would have
That
a
could be
mutual
done.
agreement.
I think your question was, is it cheaper to, I think your question that you're asking is it cheaper to work with an interconnect with another community or keeping one of your existing wells to maintain that for emergency hookup. For a long term with keeping one of your own wells, if you just keep one of your own wells, you do have to exercise that. You still have to turn around and test that on a weekly basis. Keep all the record keeping on that. What you're doing is you'll have expenses with that well that I do believe will overpass the cost of an interconnection and the amount of times that an interconnect would be needed. The other thing, too, is when I just mentioned Streamwood, that they had made some conversations with that. We do have Hanover Park real close also in proximity, right off of Newport, right off of Stearns Road. That's where their Jawa line runs right there. So they have some major pipes in that area, not just having one source or one community. We have the luxury of being very close in proximity to other communities. So, it wouldn't be out of the question to have two connections or two emergency connects down the road at that point.
Paul, since you have the microphone, I just had a quick question about why were there never wells drilled further west in Bartlett?
The geographical locations of where the wells were located when we were drilling them?
On the other side of 59?
When we look at the maps and we see the wells, they're all to the east, and none of them are to the west, closer to the Fox River. I was just curious why.
We do have one at, there is one proposed for the Southwind Boulevard. That's where our growth was. We anticipated all of our growth out to the south out to the south. That's where our wells were being drilled at that point. We do have one plan that's in the capital budget. It is out on Southwind Boulevard, right on Route 25. If you would go with this proposal of alternative 2 with that secondary connection with Elgin, you would not need that. You could turn around and get an increase of the volume of water right now and get that connection in there. Bottom line is, why were the wells located where they were? There was no growth out to the west of Route 59 when the wells were needed at that point. In 1984, it was probably started in early 80 is when we started purchasing water from Elgin. The discussion in 1984, the first agreement or the agreement with Elgin went online. So at that point, there was no need to turn around and put any additional wells out there. That's where the supply was for the Elgin water.
Yeah, most of the wells were put in when Paul and I since we're the same age, and just graduated from high school.
What happened to well number 3?
Well, number 3 was just right next door here to the south of our building. It did go bad, and at that point, it did go bad in the 80s after we were purchasing well. It had collapsed, and instead of rebuilding that at that point, it was we didn't need that demand, so we ended up capping that off at that point.
So in options number 2, 4, and 5, we don't have to worry about the regulatory compliance anymore. How much is that going to save us? Because we're not producing the water anymore.
Correct. We will not be producing the water. Right now, with our WRT systems on our deep wells, that's roughly costing us about $200,000 on an annual basis per well, just to maintain that WRT system. That's just that. So, you're saving $200,000 on an annual basis for the media exchange. Extrapolate that, you're saving money really quick.
I'm sure these
$1 million
numbers
every 10 years just in maintenance on that.
I'm sure those numbers you've factored into the O&M.
Yes.
It seems to me, too, we were also talking about the possibilities with the wells, either not having enough production or having the quality of the wells not being what they should be. And I don't know much about this aquifer, but I know that there's a huge aquifer underneath the Fox River of some sort, and I don't know how broad that is or how far it goes, and I just don't know that in reality, if we were to tap into that aquifer, would we really ever run out of water?
I don't think it's the issue of water quantity. It's the water quality that's so variable. And it's a significant expenditure, as Paul described, that we know what we're removing from the water today. It's what we don't know about what we have to remove from the water tomorrow. and what the water quality standards that we have to meet. As this water, as we're taking it up, we're finding the variability. And this issue of the removal of the barium and the is not something that was anticipated 15 years ago. This was something that was determined as we started drawing more and more water. But you're right. I mean, I do not believe that it's the quantity of water that we have to, that's a concern. It's the quality of the long-term sustainable quality of the water that we should concern ourselves with.
As far as the Fox River goes, you mentioned about the possibility of contaminant. What would be some of the examples? We're talking just about flooding in general of the Fox River. We're talking about a chemical spill. You know, what are you leading to?
Goats.
That would be something that would be a catastrophic incident, where you would have two. As an example, if you had something, it doesn't sit there. First of all, it doesn't just sit. And we asked that question of Elgin. We asked we said, what about the long-term viability? And they have great professional staff, engineers that know what the threats are up and down. It's their business, she said, to know what the threats are. And obviously they would have the ability to stop taking in water. As I said earlier, they have their own well that they could use in the emergency to supply the system, and that's what they expressed to us. And yeah, is it impossible? No. The likelihood of that occurring, because it is a fairly large watershed. I mean, as you know, it goes up into Wisconsin and drains a nice-sized area there. But yeah, that's what we wanted, and you know, I wanted to put it out. I didn't want to hide it below, saying nothing ever happens to any of these bodies of water. Certainly, there's things in Lake Michigan that you know, people the facial, right? Last week they banned in the city of Chicago the little beads that are in the facial scrubs. They're banned in the city of Chicago because they're finding their way into Lake Michigan. So there's lots of things, but you know, we believe that as a state water survey that it's a large enough watershed. We asked about the low flow, the droughts, how high the water got, their intake structure. They have a pretty well-versed staff at the Elgin.
How many other communities does Elgin service?
Who else do they service?
South Elgin?
It doesn't have that much water.
Definitely take that.
Dr. Burke, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to ask Valerie, how much are we annually paying in water to Elgin, just out of curiosity? How much are we annually paying in water to Elgin?
About $4.5 million.
$4.5 million. Okay. So that's enough for them to be willing to negotiate. You know, they don't want to lose that, in other words.
You know, they don't, and we negotiated a long time with the status quo to see where we could move that around to provide some stability in the future for both the rates and the percentage we bump that we get from their residents. And you know, status quo wasn't very interested in for them to be able to reduce those costs much. And when we began to look at some of the other options, we felt, and they agreed, that there was real momentum to lower our rates and get a better product to begin with also.
Okay. When we start saving money, it looks like at $3 million we start getting from Elgin. It goes down on the new.
We would get it immediately if it'd be from 25 to 1.15, so you would get that immediately. And then as you start going up, exactly, you'd start seeing a decrease.
And one of the things that I think is important about that option is that we asked them if we had the ability to begin now and not wait to 2019 to be able to capture some of those savings for our residents, and they have tentatively agreed to that. Obviously, I didn't negotiate an agreement with Elgin, but put together, I think, a shell agreement that gave you folks enough information to compare it with the other option, but there would still be a lot of issues to iron out as a part of that.
Question, we have 7 wells working. We dismantle, can we sell them? Can we get any money off those guys? List them on eBay?
I don't think there's anything we can do with those wells. I think the least expensive thing is to shut them down and not have to pay to continue to operate them and test them and exercise them. Keep the ones if we need them for an emergency purpose, but as Paul's pointed out, it's probably a lot more economical to have a connection with another town rather than that.
Dr. Burke, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's very informative and it seems to be pretty comprehensive, I guess. So I do have a number of questions. You might be able to answer all of them, though, with one simple question. This has been described as a legacy issue, and I think that it is. So I think that it's really just critical that we take our time and think through this and look at all of the different options, and look at everything that's on the table and some things that maybe aren't. As I went through this and as you've gone through this, clearly, as it should be, cost is a really big factor in where we're going, and I think it probably weighs very heavily on the determination of that, cost being overall cost. But just for the sake of argument, if everything was free or everything was $1, I don't care. If the price were equal between all 5 options, would your recommendation change?
It's a good question. They're all the same.
If price wasn't the option, or price wasn't of concern. Clearly it is, I get that.
You know, what I would do is weigh the fact that where you are with respect to the different sources then, and start looking at, a long way from Lake Michigan. Things can and will happen. You're a relatively short distance away from Elgin, and certainly anybody that has I would consider those to be very comparable, and you'd weigh the reliability of the system. What could go wrong in the delivery of the water? I would think that you'd probably want to get out, if everything was the same, you'd want to get out of the well business, just because of the inherent uncertainties in that water supply.
Very good.
So I would think that you'd weigh then what's less likely to occur, a break in 30 miles of line, 40 miles, 50 miles, whatever it is, to the lakeshore and the circuitous routes and the pumping stations that lie between here and the lake, or would you rely on the shorter distance and the current Elgin supply? If this was a community that you're buying from that only had 10,000 people, I'd say, reconsider that you would want to have someone that has a large facility that can provide it. But knowing the Elgin facility being large enough to accommodate this without really even feeling it. This is a big facility. They have, you're a big user, but not a huge user for their system. So I hope I answer your question.
I think you did. So if I'm hearing you correctly, essentially you're saying all things being considered equal, you would likely still favor the Fox Water.
Yes.
Option number, what we're calling option number 2. All right. And when we compare, one of the things that many of the residents who heard about this and have talked to me about water over the years have always said, when are we getting Lake Michigan water? When are we getting Lake Michigan water? And that's not an uncommon thing for people to ask. If I'm hearing you, you're also telling me, though, that quality-wise, contaminants, particulates, all those measurable things that come out in the water quality reports that we look at, that the water that we would receive from Elgin is as good as what we would get from Lake Michigan?
Yes, and we try to compare, although it's impossible to compare directly, the water quality reports. We included those for Elgin as well as the City of Chicago and appendix of the report. Okay. So they're very comparable.
They're very comparable. So a glass-by-glass comparison, the average person's not going to notice the difference at all.
Can we bring some
Thanks. Well, here's the,
tasting.
There is a taste. When I say taste, I'm very sensitive. My office is in Rosemont. They get Lake Michigan water. The health club. I know it doesn't look like I go to the health club, but I do. And in the shower, you can smell when the lake turns over, that organic smell from Lake Michigan water. And I've been told that that same smell is something that you smell from Fox River water. I've been told that only 1 in 7 people can actually, notice that smell. So, I mean, it's
Chlorine tastes like chlorine.
yeah,
We
chlorine.
probably
and
have
then-
90% of those people.
Yeah. So right. I mean, but there is a taste,
Touché.
and then it's kind of hard to say that I never tasted that in Lake Michigan water. I think that the water source is the same. Water falls from the sky, it comes into the river, and comes into the lake, so they
I do
both.
have, I'm sorry, sir. A few more questions that I think are a little more related to money and that type of thing. Under the status quo option, you're talking about 3 additional structures for an additional, or 3 or 4 different additional structures for an additional 4 million gallons of additional water, additional staff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If our usage is not projected to go up so much, why do we have such a significant increase in these infrastructure costs?
Sure. Well, first of all, I threw this up.
Or
This is the status quo. We would put, as Paul said, if you went with the options, the other options, you would not have to put in that well that you've already been programming and been on your budget. So you have to put that in, and that's what we put up here. This deep well and the pump. You'd have to put in additional the well treatment facility, and you'd have to put in you have to buy the land. And then in the case, what we looked at is softening of all the existing wells, because the water that right now the water you're getting is not from the wells is not softened. You're getting water from Elgin that is softened, but in this case we were looking at, if you're going to go this status quo, it's time to put in the additional well and make everything equal.
So this isn't truly a status quo. This is a status quo with the improvements that would be needed.
Which you've
Is that
deferred,
a
yes.
fair statement?
Which would you do the things that you've deferred? Paul said that you've had this on the budget, budgeted item for the last couple of years. 5 years.
And I'm sorry, some of these questions are scattered like my brain. Is Elgin entirely river water, or is it also a blend?
It has a well as emergency backup, but we understand from our conversation that it's on a given day it's 100% surface water. Mark?
Right. Yeah. Even through the last drought, they drew fully from the river.
I also noticed that on some of the options, option 4 and 5, you were talking about an additional 20,000 feet of new water main. Not the distribution, but regular water main. I'm assuming that's within the village. And I'm curious why that would be necessary with Lake Michigan water, but not the Fox River.
Okay. The 20,000 feet, we're talking about these lines that would be necessary to connect you up to in this case, the red being the Jawa line, and in this case, the purple being so one was 23, and one was what, Mark? I think I did this later on.
And then on top,
We had,
24.
Okay.
we had 20,000 feet of internal main improvements for both the 100% Elgin option and the Lake Michigan water options. And the reason being is that you've got 2 sources on either the east end of town or 2 sources on the west end of town, whereas now you have wells kind of dispersed throughout the community. So it was an estimate of what you might need in order to move water from one side of town to the other side of town. So we did add 20,000 feet for
2, 4, and
3
5.
of those options.
For 2, 4, and 5. So does that make sense? Because right now, you got wells here, you got the connection here. In the future, you're going to have it either on the left side, the west side of town, or the east side of town. And so you need to adjust the pressures and make sure the system works.
I think that satisfies my curiosity for the moment. Thank
Good
you.
questions.
I'm
Thank
sure
you.
I'll have more.
Questions?
With regards to hardness, you had mentioned that the well water was obviously very hard, but in reality, Bartlett really is somewhere in between. The Elgin, combining the Elgin water with the well water, our hardness, the grains are lower. Do you have any idea what the grain for the combined water of hardness is?
It really depends on where you
does it? That's because we were
blended.
discussing this, and Trustee Ranke said that his water is quite hard, and yet I had a soft water company come to my house, check my water, and said, your water is actually pretty good. It's not hard at all.
In general, the closer you live to the connection, you're going to get a higher amount of the Elgin water, which is softer than the water pumping out of the wells. So it just depends where you live and how it's mixed in the distribution system.
So we are truly a blended community.
Yes.
That water's not mixed in a big place somewhere, it's just because it's
No,
in the
there's no
system,
mixers.
it kind of...
You inject the water at the sources of the wells and at the Elgin connection, and it depends on withdrawals. Water will take, once it gets in the system, water takes the path of least resistance. So if someone's using a lot of water there, the other water will rush towards that extraction and withdrawal. So
Just because you live on the south side of town doesn't necessarily mean currently you're not getting any Elgin water. It means you're probably getting mainly well water. Is that a fair assumption?
yes,
Okay.
on the average day.
Have we taken into effect any water towers we're going to have to replace?
We have not included any replacement. We've included additions. If we had to replace them, they would be the same for, I assume, for all the options. If we had to do any additional maintenance, every option would have that as an overlay. So it would be equally an add-on to each one of those. Paul, do you think of any right now that are in need of replacement other than...
Not full replacement. There are some that needs maintenance, but no full replacement.
What is our oldest water tower? The one across the street from the tracks? Half million
Paint job.
gallons?
Maybe we could have Elgin repaint it for us.
Trying to think back when he was in high school.
Circle is probably the oldest. We purchased that in '75. That was built in the early '60s. The one on Oneida was '61 when that went into existence. Ground storage is like '68, just south of the Village Hall.
For the pumping stations, do we have those land set aside already? Or we have for the, if we do DuPage or if we do, either one? Because Elgin's on one side. Do we have a site for that already or no?
We do not.
It'd just be somewhere over there.
We assume $250,000 of land acquisition for construction of the well site and the pumping and storage facilities.
Okay.
You've not purchased those.
Okay. Could we put that in, what's that sliver, not Brewster Creek, it's the industrial park?
That would be the general direction of it, absolutely.
I mean, ideally, people don't want that next to them if they can help it.
They're going to be using all the water anyway.
Making pasta.
My question's about accountability for Elgin. What do you attribute the increase in demand to? Everything that I had jotted down here, with the exception of a couple, have been answered. My biggest curiosity is we've talked about 5 alternatives without really ever explaining what the net effect to residents will be in cost.
Okay. Obviously, each one of the costs, and we try to figure out how we can best identify what the future costs. The one thing that happens is then on the existing situation, you know what your rates are. Every year, you're beefing your rates up in order to
I don't
accommodate.
like to use that word.
Okay.
Mandatorily increasing because of cost.
You make it commensurate with what Elgin,
Sure.
what it's costing you to produce. In this particular case, and the options that we're looking at, the Elgin option 2, 4, or 5, you're going out and you're paying other people to get the water. You're out of the production business. And so they obviously are charging you to do that. And right now, that water that you're mining water, you're not paying for it right now. We'll see what happens in the next, until someone figures out a way to tax underground water. So right now you're not doing it. So if you look at some of the water rates with 100% well may be the least expensive for producing, right? but it still gets you immersed into a high-risk proposition versus the other options.
Yeah, I understand the different factors of all of the alternatives, certainly.
Sure.
You've laid those out extremely eloquently. But again, my question is, and ultimately probably at the next meeting, we'll have some information about, here's what the residents are paying now, and here's what they'll pay with this option, and here's what we would predict they would pay with this option.
Sure.
We'll probably wind up eliminating a couple of them based on maybe some of that information. So that'd be something I'd be interested in. And also, one thing that really piqued my curiosity, Dr. Burke, was when you said that the idea of I think there's some opportunities for income and some absolute opportunities for savings that I didn't see touched on yet. The income portion would be, if I do my calculations right, if we're going to, right now we're paying them $4.5 million. If we jump up to 100%, we're going to pay them about $8 million. 0.15% of that is about $1.2 million a year. So that's going to be income for Elgin. So that's kind of opportunity lost for Bartlett. We're basically, for the cost of us not worrying about production, we lose that ability to absorb that revenue stream. So I would like to see those numbers weighed. That would be interesting. Number two, I would love to see what the savings is going to be when we do not have to maintain all 7 of these wells. It's got to be immense. It's got to be no staffing, no reporting, no testing. Paul had identified a few of them, less staff to deal with it.
Absolutely. And we try to quantify that, Mark? We did.
When you say we don't pay for anything in option 1 and option 3,
do we quantify
it,
Mark?
pay on staff and I mean the regulation and the maintenance of the equipment. That's a cost to us.
Yes.
Is some of it in here, and it'll just maybe be ferreted out more detailed?
Sure. We'll take a look at that.
Give us an opportunity to see what's embedded here.
Sure.
and do a more detailed analysis of those issues. We certainly can do that.
Sure, absolutely.
And we can
Great.
add back the cost of not having to put in the additional well out west, because we have money off to the side for that.
Actually, we had a federal grant for that, and we were able to convince the federal government to allow us to use that money for part of our well number 8. So anticipating that it would take longer to build that, even if we go with all of our wells, we got that money repurposed.
Okay. So we have that to work with also. Thank you.
Through all this light reading, I had to highlight a bunch of other things too. But that was really informative. My brain is done.
Okay.
So, I guess we'll move this. I'll be acting as Chairman Aaron's, and thank you, Dr. Burke. And we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Moving along.
Do you have any other comments? Does the staff have any other comments? I'd just like to, before we end, thank Mr. Kester deeply for being here and sharing his knowledge with us once again. Thank you, Paul. We appreciate it.
I assume Valerie will be having several more discussions on this, I know.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. We are not under any difficult time frame on this at all, and we planned that.
Yeah. Elgin's not holding our feet to the fire, is what you're saying. Okay.
I'm having a hard time believing that I'm actually saying this, but I'm kind of sorry the press wasn't here tonight to review this.
Who's that?
The press.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no.
Been a very good meeting for them.
It's a pretty deep topic.
But
If there's nothing else, anybody have any comments, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. By Trustee Kammerer, seconded by Trustee Martin. And the clerk, please call the roll.
Trustee Kammerer?
Yes.
Carbonaro?
Yes.
Martin?
Yes.
Ranky?
Yes.
Shipman?
yes.
For adjourn.